All right, it's time to talk about the show and tell. So, the goal with National History Day is that you're able to tell a really interesting story that's based on facts, which you researched yourself. So, this week is your first attempt at telling that story. Today, Monday, we're going to write the story. You'll turn in your best version by the end of the week, and then I'll have time to look at it and you'll refine it in January. The rest of the week, we'll work on finding visuals to go with the story. So start anywhere you want, but after we've done our work with thesis statements today, you'll really be able to start to figure out which parts of the story are you missing. So there's only one of these show and tells due per team, but everybody needs to be working in the document. It can't be like just one person does it. Most of National History Day is about showing things, but if you don't have a good story to tell, it's really hard to show a lot. So look at the do column. Let's just make sure that as we're working on the show and tell, that you do make sure that you're summarizing the things that you've learned so far. We are going to have evidence, but the evidence is usually going to be quotes or visuals that you will find. I do not want to hear or read you saying, I think in this document, you really only have so many words. Don't tell me I chose this or I'm saying this because you really have to be clear and get to the point. Stay within the limits. We will do lots of revisions. Don't be afraid of revisions. So give me your best shot, but it doesn't have to be perfect. All right, so we're going to start with a thesis statement. The thesis statement here, I fixed the one based on the video we watched on Friday about Loving versus Virginia. So in 1958, Mildred and Richard Loving broke Virginia's unconstitutional barrier to interracial marriage. When the U.S. Supreme Court found the law was unconstitutional in 1967, the barriers of discrimination and inequality were eliminated across the country. Their story still inspires the fight for marriage equality today. All right, now I need to tell the story of context, and I believe I'm only allowed probably 50 words here. Most of these boxes are 50 words. So this is the context. This is the long before. In the case of what we're talking about this week, this year's theme, this should really help your audience to understand the barriers that were created and how they got there. In this case, the barrier, we said, was interracial marriage being against the law. And where does that come from? So I discovered that only 10 states did not have laws against interracial marriage in 1958. That means most states did, 40. Some laws dated back to the early 1700s. 11 states had repealed laws by 1887, and by 1967, it was only southern states that had anti-miscegenation laws. And then this is something to think about. The word miscegenation is a word we don't really use much today, but if you have terms like that, you need to define them for your audience. So miscegenation is a word invented in 1863 to describe interracial relationships. It's a word born out of fear. As the Civil War ended and Southerners faced a world where people of color might be treated equally, they quickly put up Jim Crow laws in place to regulate that interaction. All right, the next step is build up. So think about, in this case, for build up, how did the barrier start to weaken? What opportunities became available? What obstacles were in the way of the barrier coming down? In this case, it's the civil rights movement, right? So 1954, 4 years earlier, the Brown versus Board of Education case by the Supreme Court had decided separate but equal was not okay. 1955, Rosa Parks. 1957, school integration. So things are starting to happen, and that is why the Lovings decide they're going to take on this law. The heart of the story, the big mistake I see here a lot is that people will just answer these questions, but they won't tell it in the form of a story. Imagine how uninteresting a story would be if someone just said the what, how, why, without actually making it an interesting story. So in this case, Mildred and Richard were married in Washington, D.C., so they really weren't violating the law. But if you think about the movie preview that we watched, someone called the police with an anonymous tip and they raided their home in the middle of the night. Then they arrested them. They charged them with a felony, and they were supposed to go to jail for 1 to 5 years. They both pled guilty. And instead of sending them to jail, they said you had to leave the state of Virginia. You can't come back for 25 years. That's a problem. I mean, imagine having to leave all of your friends and family and all of your support. And so they did leave and move to a different state, but they wanted to come back to Virginia. And so they decide they're going to ask the Secretary of State, President Kennedy's brother, to help them. They found this ACLU to help them, and they did challenge their conviction all the way to the Supreme Court. So why did that matter? All right, this is where I wanted to show you. I know the answer to this because I worked on this project a couple years ago. But if you get to the short-term impact and you don't know how to tell me or your audience why it matters that the barrier was broken, what difference happened, tell me what you do know, right? This isn't the strongest answer, but I do know as a result, they were terrorized by hate groups. And then I've came up with questions that I need to answer now. How soon did other states end their interracial marriage laws? And how many interracial couples are there now? Not difficult things to find, but because you have to come up with something by the end of the week, if you get to this part today, just put some questions down. Writing something is 100% better, especially at this point, than writing nothing. Because if you have something, I can help you, okay? If you have nothing, I can't help you. And finally, the long-term change is how you're going to connect it to today. So think about the fights that have been happening nationally for people trying to get their marriages recognized. So back in 2015, same-sex couples were fighting and they took their case all the way to the Supreme Court, very similar to what Loving versus Virginia had done. And so I don't have a lot written here. I think I only get 50 words again. I haven't used that, but then I'd have to have that question if I was turning this in this week before I go away for winter break. And that's what we're focusing on today.